Reddit, what's your darkest family secret? My aunt ran off with her husband's brother. They live together now, but the family pretends she doesn't exist. What's even weirder is that her husband and brother still talk like nothing ever happened, and they don't bring it up at family gatherings. It's like everyone just agreed to forget, even though it's the most obvious elephant in the room. My grandfather was a Nazi during WWII, and after the war, he faked his identity to escape prosecution. He never told anyone until his deathbed. We found old documents in the attic, including photos of him in uniform and letters he wrote under a different name. It completely changed how we saw him, and no one in the family talks about him anymore. My cousin went to prison for attempted murder. He tried to set his ex-girlfriend's house on fire while she was inside. What's even darker is that the family stood by him throughout the trial, saying the girl was lying and trying to ruin his life. He ended up serving 15 years, and when he got out, everyone acted like nothing ever happened. We found out my uncle wasn't my biological uncle after my aunt passed away. He was her best friend who lived with her for 30 years. Turns out they were having an affair the whole time, and my uncle just pretended to be my aunt's platonic roommate. They had a secret child together who's now in their 40s. No one had a clue. My father faked his death to avoid paying child support. He was found alive 10 years later, living in another state under a different name. He had remarried and started a new family. When we tracked him down, he denied everything at first, but eventually admitted to it. He still won't talk to us, and I haven't seen him in years. My grandmother had an affair with her sister's husband. My mother is actually the product of that affair, but no one knows except me. I found out through some old letters when my grandmother passed away, and it feels like this huge, dark cloud hanging over my head. I have no idea if I should tell my mom or let it stay buried. My older brother disappeared when I was a kid. My parents told me he ran away, but years later I found out he died of a drug overdose, and they buried him in the woods. I overheard a conversation between my parents one night, and I still don't know where they buried him. Every time I ask about my brother, they just change the subject. My aunt poisoned her own parents to inherit the family estate early. She served time in prison, and no one ever talks about it. The family pretends she's just a black sheep, but the truth is she's a murderer. My dad doesn't even speak her name anymore, and she wasn't invited to a single family event after she got out of prison. My dad accidentally killed his best friend while they were teenagers. They were playing with a gun, and it went off. He never talked about it, and I only found out when my uncle told me after my dad died. The friend's parents never pressed charges, and it was ruled an accident, but my dad was never the same after that. My uncle was married with kids, but secretly gay. He had a relationship with another man for over a decade. When his wife found out, she divorced him and moved the kids across the country. No one ever talked about why, and my cousins grew up thinking their mom just hated their dad. It wasn't until I was older that I found out the truth. My great-grandmother gave up 2 of her children for adoption during the Great Depression, and no one ever knew. She kept it secret her whole life, but after she passed away, we found out about them when we were going through her papers. They would have been my great-aunts and uncles, but we've never been able to track them down. My aunt was sent to a mental institution in the 1970s because she had a child out of wedlock. She was told the baby died, but it turns out the child was given up for adoption without her consent. She didn't find out until decades later, and she's been trying to find her child ever since. My uncle died in a car crash when he was 20, but what no one knew was that he had been drinking and driving. The family always told us it was a tragic accident, but I found out years later from a police report that he had been heavily intoxicated. It changed how I saw him, knowing that his death could have been avoided. My cousin was abused by her stepfather for years, and when she finally told the family, no one believed her. She ended up running away and cutting contact with everyone. It wasn't until years later that the stepfather was arrested for doing the same thing to someone else. Now the family regrets not believing her, but it's too late. My dad had a secret second family for 15 years. He would tell us he was going on business trips, but really he was visiting his other wife and kids. We didn't find out until after he died, when both families showed up at the funeral. It was the most awkward, horrifying experience of my life. My mother accidentally killed her brother when they were kids, They were playing with a rope in the barn, and he got tangled up and strangled to death. It was ruled an accident, but she's carried that guilt her entire life. She only told me about it when I was an adult, and it explains so much about why she's always been so protective of me. My grandfather was abusive to his entire family, but no one talks about it. He used to beat my grandmother and their kids, but when he died, everyone acted like he was some kind of hero. My dad has so much unresolved trauma from it, but he just bottles it up and never talks about what really happened. My aunt was caught embezzling money from the family business, and instead of turning her in, the family covered it up. They sold the business to pay off the debt she created, and now she lives overseas. Everyone pretends she just moved for a new job, but the truth is she was running from the law. My grandmother abandoned her first child when she was a teenager. She got pregnant out of wedlock and left the baby on the steps of a church. She never told anyone, and we only found out when my dad did the DNA test and matched with someone claiming to be his half-sibling. My dad has an identical twin brother who was institutionalized when they were teenagers. He had severe mental health issues and was sent away, and no one ever visited him. My dad never talks about him, and I only found out when I saw an old family photo with someone I didn't recognize. My cousin was involved in a hit and run when he was 19. He was never caught, and the family helped him cover it up. He's lived with the guilt ever since, and every time a news story comes up about the case, I can see it eating away at him. My mom got pregnant at 17 and had an abortion, but she never told anyone. She confessed it to me when I was a teenager, and it completely changed the way I saw her. She's always been super anti-abortion, and finding out about her past made me realize just how much she's been repressing. My grandfather killed a man in self-defense during a robbery, but instead of going to the police, he buried the body and never told anyone. It wasn't until decades later, when someone found bones on the property, that the truth came out. The family kept quiet about it, and nothing was ever proven. My uncle was a drug dealer for most of his life. He made a ton of money, but lost it all after a bad deal went wrong. He ended up in prison for several years, but the family tells everyone he was just away on business during that time. My mom secretly put my dad in rehab after she found out he had been using heroin for years. None of us kids knew. She told us he was away on a work trip, but it was really a detox center. My cousin is actually my half-sister. My mom had an affair with my uncle, but everyone pretends it never happened. She doesn't know the truth, and I'm not sure if I should ever tell her. My aunt tried to kill her husband by poisoning his food. She put antifreeze in his drinks for months, but he survived. She's in prison now, and we're told never to speak her name again. My father had a gambling addiction that nearly bankrupted our family. He racked up so much debt that my mom had to take on a second job just to keep us afloat. He eventually went to rehab, but the shame still lingers. My brother-in-law killed someone in a bar fight when he was in his 20s. He served time, but no one in the family talks about it. It's a dark stain on his past, and I don't think anyone will ever truly forgive him. My grandma ran a brothel in the 1950s, and no one in the family knew until she died. When we were cleaning out her attic, we found old photos and receipts. It completely changed how we saw her. My uncle has been married 4 times, and 3 of his ex-wives died under mysterious circumstances. No one's ever been able to prove anything, but the family has always suspected something darker. My dad wasn't my real dad. I found out through a 23 and me test that my biological father was a guy my mom had a fling with in college. She never told anyone, and my dad still doesn't know. My cousin was kidnapped when she was a child. She was missing for a few weeks before they found her, but no one in the family ever talks about what happened to her during that time. It's like it's been erased from history. My great-grandfather was a bootlegger during Prohibition. He made a small fortune selling illegal alcohol, and it's the reason our family was able to buy land and build wealth. None of this is ever mentioned at family reunions. My father was in the witness protection program for years before I was born. He testified against a major crime syndicate, and we had to move states multiple times growing up because of it. None of my friends know, and I never tell anyone. My cousin faked having cancer to get attention, shaved her head and everything. It went on for over a year before she got caught in the lie. The family was furious, but we still don't bring it up. My grandfather had a whole second family on the other side of town. He was married to my grandma, but he had another wife and kids he supported. After he died, the two families met for the first time at the funeral. My uncle went missing for 5 years. Turns out he was living in a different state under a fake name because he had committed fraud and didn't want to go to jail. He eventually came back, but no one talks about those years he was gone. My grandmother confessed on her deathbed that she once abandoned my mom at a grocery store when she was a toddler. She got scared and went back for her, but it still haunts her to this day. My dad once told me that he and his brothers had to beat up their stepdad to stop him from abusing their mom. They were just teenagers, and after the fight, their stepdad disappeared. No one knows what happened to him, and no one ever talks about it. My aunt had a child in high school that she gave up for adoption. No one knew until her biological daughter tracked her down when she turned 18. It was a shock to the entire family. My great-grandmother had an abortion in the 1940s. She was married but didn't want more kids, and it was illegal at the time. She did it herself with some kind of herb mixture. It wasn't until my grandma told me that I even knew this part of our history. My cousin killed someone in a drunk driving accident. He got away with it because he fled the scene and no one could prove he was behind the wheel. To this day, the family knows, but it's never discussed. My dad was an arsonist. When he was young, he used to set random buildings on fire. He was never caught, but he told me one night when he was drunk. He says he did it just to feel in control of something. My sister married a man who abused her. She never told anyone for years until one night he almost killed her. She escaped with her kids in the middle of the night, and we've never seen him since. The family still doesn't talk about the signs we all missed. My mom's brother was killed in a drug deal gone wrong, but the family told everyone he died in a car accident. I only found out when I overheard a conversation at a family gathering when I was older. My dad went to prison for armed robbery before I was born. My family kept it from me my whole life. I only found out when I applied for a job that required a background check and his criminal record came up. My grandfather killed his first wife and made it look like an accident. He pushed her off a cliff while they were hiking. The family always suspected foul play but could never prove it. My aunt married a man who was wanted for murder in another state. He had been on the run for years using a fake name. When he was finally caught, it was a huge scandal, and my aunt has never remarried. My dad used to be part of a cult when he was younger. He left before I was born, but it still haunts him. Sometimes he'll talk about the strange rituals they made him do, but then he clams up and won't say more. My uncle shot a guy in a bar fight and killed him. He claimed self-defense and wasn't charged, but the family knew it wasn't as clear-cut as he made it seem. They all helped cover it up. My great-grandfather was a slave owner. He owned a plantation in the South, and when slavery was abolished, he refused to let his slaves go. It's something the family has tried to hide for generations. My cousin tried to kill himself after he was caught embezzling from his company. Well, he survived, but he's never been the same since. The family rallied around him, but it's still a dark chapter no one brings up. My dad's first wife disappeared mysteriously, and even though he was never charged, there were rumors that he was involved. I've always wondered if he had something to do with it, but I've never had the courage to ask. My mom had an affair with her best friend's husband, and broke up both marriages. I only found out because I caught them together when I was 16. The fallout was massive, and my mom's best friend moved away. My uncle was a hitman for a local gang. He did time for unrelated charges, but was never caught for the hits. And he's an old man now, and sometimes I wonder how many people he killed that no one knows about. My grandmother was in a mental institution for most of her life. The family always told me she was dead, but I found out later that they just didn't want to deal with her. She died alone, and we didn't even go to her funeral. My brother was part of a gang in his teens. He got into some serious trouble, and the family had to move to a new city to escape the violence. He turned his life around, but it's a part of our history that's never discussed. My mom had a secret bank account with thousands of dollars she was saving to leave my dad. She never did, but when she died, we found the account. My dad was devastated when he found out. My great-uncle was a hoarder. When he died, we found his house packed floor to ceiling with junk, including thousands of dollars in cash hidden among the mess. It was like something out of a horror movie. My dad was a petty criminal in his youth. He would steal cars, break into houses, and even rob stores. He eventually straightened out, but I still get weird looks from family members who remember his past. My cousin had a baby and gave her up for adoption, but no one in the family ever knew. It wasn't until her daughter tracked her down 20 years later that the secret came out. My grandfather was in the mob. He ran numbers and was involved in some shady deals. We never knew the full extent of his criminal activities, but there were whispers that he did some terrible things.